I wanted to see if I could automate virtual machine deployments. I've set a few rules. No pressure. For security reasons, the lab environment blocks outbound traffic. That means I can't use ChatGPT. And that means I'm going to have to write the code myself. Or am I? The browser window that you're looking at here is not inside the Hands-On Labs. This is a browser window that's running from my local machine. So in this browser window, I'm going to go to chat.openai.com, and I'm going to ask ChatGPT to create a function for us. As you can see, I've asked ChatGPT to generate a function that will take a number and return a 4-digit number with leading zeros. And what I'm going to do is take this code and slightly tweak it over in Orchestrator. Let's go back to Orchestrator and let's write that code. Now, as you can see, I made a few modifications, but that was primarily just to simplify this code. So now that we have this new function, I should be able to tell line number 5 to call that function, pass in the counter variable, and thereby, let me get the parenthesis there. There we go. And by slightly modifying line number 5, now it will generate machine names called myVM dash followed by a 4-digit number. All right, so we've tackled that challenge, but you'll recall I said a few moments ago that while line number 3 looks like the right thing to do, this isn't really the right thing to do. Sometimes you'll say var variable inside of your scriptable tasks, and sometimes that will make sense, but in this context, it doesn't. And the reason why it doesn't make sense is a local variable does not allow its value outside of the scriptable task that we're in. You're going to see in a moment, it's important that we allow it to change that number. So instead of creating a local variable, let's get rid of line 3. And what we're going to do is we are going to create a new variable. This is going to be a variable for our workflow, not just this single scriptable task, but for our entire workflow. So we'll go to that variables tab. We'll say we want to create a new variable, and we'll call our variable counter. By the way, this name happens to match the name that we're using in the code that we wrote. The names don't have to match, but in this case, it'll be easy if it does. Let me type a description. And I think this is the first instance where we're going to have to change the type. We don't want this to be a string. We want it to be a number. So we type number, remember to select number, and then we can either pre-assign a value to this variable, or if we wanted to, we could set it programmatically in our code. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to say that our first VM is going to be 0001. So we'll just say 1 here and create this variable. So now our workflow has a counter variable that we could potentially use in any of these schema elements. Well, as you know right now, the schema element that we need to use it in is this one here, the scriptable task. So let's select the scriptable task, and we're going to go to the inputs/outputs section. And what we're going to do is we're going to add that counter variable as an input, which is easy enough. You just go to inputs, click add, click select variable. We already created the variable, so we'll choose counter. Doing this allows this scriptable task to see what the value is in the counter variable. But we're also going to go to the output section and we're going to add an outward binding. This is essentially the same process. So again, I'm going to say choose counter. But whereas this inward binding allows us to see what the value of the counter variable is, this outward binding is going to allow us to change the value. In many cases, you'll only do an inward binding or you'll only do an outward binding. But in this case, because we want to see and change the value, we need both an inward binding and an outward binding. All right, this is looking good. Why don't we click validate to see if this workflow is valid? Looks good so far. The workflow's not done just yet, but I always like to incrementally test what I'm doing. So I'm going to save this workflow. and I'm going to run the workflow. Since there's no inputs to this new workflow, oh man, our workflow blew up. Maybe it's a binding error, or maybe ChatGPT is not so great at writing code after all. Join me in the next video and we'll debug this and figure out what's going wrong.